The chandelier above the Hartwell Grand Ballroom held 600 crystal drops, each one catching the light like a trapped star. Elena Marsh had counted them twice, once out of boredom, and once because she was trying very hard not to look at the man across the room who had been watching her for the last 40 minutes. She wasn't supposed to be here. That was the truth. She kept turning over in her mind as she stood near the far wall with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, wearing a borrowed emerald gown that was half an inch too long and kept threatening to trip her. The invitation had come through her cousin Britt, who worked as a junior event coordinator for the Hargrove Foundation, the charity organization hosting tonight's winter gala. Britt had come down with a fever that afternoon, handed Elena the credentials badge, and said, "Just stand near the dessert table and make sure nobody knocks over the sugar sculpture." That was Elena's entire job for the evening. Stunt. Look presentable. Protect the sugar swan. She had not expected to be watched. The man doing the watching stood near the arched doorway to the east terrace, surrounded by 3 other men in suits who were clearly not there for the canapés. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of someone who had spent their life making a point of it, but in the quiet way of a person who simply occupied more space than others without trying. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone who was angry at softness, a white dress shirt open 1 button, too many at the collar. Sleeves rolled to the elbow in a room full of men in black tie. Elena had noticed him the same way. You notice a weather change before you can explain why. Your body already knows. She looked away. She looked back. He was still watching. This went on for 40 minutes. Then the orchestra, which had been playing something slow and forgettable in the background, shifted into a waltz. The tempo changed. Couples drifted toward the center of the floor, and the man across the room set down his glass, said something brief to the men beside him, and walked directly toward Elena with the kind of certainty that suggested he had never in his life been told no, and genuinely could not picture what that would feel like. He stopped in front of her. He was even more unsettling up close. "You've been standing against that wall for 47 minutes, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with a faint accent she couldn't place somewhere between old money and somewhere much older. "You haven't eaten anything. You haven't spoken to anyone. And you've been staring at the ceiling." "I was counting the crystals," Elena said. He looked up briefly, as though he might count them too, then looked back at her. "How many?" 612. Though I may have miscounted the cluster near the 3rd support beam. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the idea of one passing through. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a question. She noticed that immediately. "I'm working," she said. He glanced at the untouched glass in her hand, then at the sugar swan 10 feet away, then back at her. "Doing what?" "Exactly. I'm guarding that." A pause. "The swan. It took 14 hours to make. My cousin would never forgive me if something happened to it." He looked at the swan for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and then, unexpectedly, in a way that seemed to surprise even him, he laughed. It was a short sound, almost reluctant, like something that had escaped before he could stop it. "Dance with me," he said again. And this time there was something different underneath the words. Not softer, exactly, but different. "On a waltz. I'll have someone watch the swan." He turned his head slightly and made the smallest possible gesture with 2 fingers. One of the suited men near the doorway materialized beside the dessert table within seconds. hands clasped behind his back. Standing guard. Elena stared at this for a moment. That's slightly terrifying, she said. Most things worth having are. He extended his hand. One dance. She should have said no. She knew, in some practical, self-preserving part of her brain, that she should have said no. She was here to do a job, a small, unimportant job. But still, she didn't know this man. She didn't know why he'd crossed an entire ballroom for her specifically. She didn't know why his laugh had sounded like something he rationed carefully. She put her hand in his prostate. His fingers closed around hers, and he led her onto the floor with the same unhurried certainty that seemed to characterize everything he did. When he placed his other hand at her waist, Elena felt the warmth of it through the fabric of the gown like a brand. They began to move. He danced the way she imagined he did everything else without visible effort, as though the music had arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. Elena was a passable dancer under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances, she discovered she was better than she'd realized, because he made it easy without appearing to try. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Elena." "Dominic," he said. She waited for a last name. He didn't offer one. They turned at the corner of the floor. Around them, other couples moved. But Elena had the strange sensation of being inside a smaller, quieter space that only contained the two of them. "You don't recognize me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like a note of something relief. Maybe. Or curiosity. Should I? Most people in this room do. Elena glanced around briefly. She noticed, now that she was looking, that there was a particular quality to the way the other guests weren't looking at Dominic. Too deliberate. The practiced non-gaze of people who were very aware of where he was and were working hard not to show it. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who hasn't danced in 4 years," he said, which was not an answer. And they both knew it. The waltz moved through its second phrase. Elena's borrowed gown swept the floor. The 612 crystals above them threw small lights across every surface. "If you dance this waltz with me," Dominic said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, quieter, more deliberate. "I'll marry you." Elena missed a step. He caught her. Of course, he caught her, and she looked up at his face to find the expression of a man who had just said something he found faintly amusing. "I beg your pardon," she said. "It's a simple proposal. You're a reasonable woman. Consider it. You've known me for 4 minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He corrected. "And I've been watching you for 47. That's not better. I know what I want." He said simply, "I've spent a long time knowing what I want. It doesn't usually take me this long to act on it." Elena stared at him. "Is this how you normally talk to people?" "No," he said. "Usually, I don't explain myself at all." She couldn't tell, and this unsettled her more than anything else whether he was serious. That was the night Elena Marsh danced one waltz with Dominic Varro, who was, as she would learn in fragments over the following 72 hours, the head of the Varro Syndicate, a name that controlled more of the Eastern Seaboard's shadow economy than any federal agency wanted to officially acknowledge. He had not attended a public social event in 4 years, not since his wife had died. Not since he had retreated into the kind of silence that powerful men use like armor. The Hargrove Gala was a business obligation. Nothing more. He had not expected to cross a ballroom for a woman guarding a sugar swan. Elena, for her part, did not discover who he was until the following morning. When Britt recovered enough to text her 17 times in rapid succession, after seeing a photograph on a social media account that tracked the movements of the city's wealthiest and most dangerous figures, the photograph showed Elena and Dominic Waltz looking at each other. Britt's 17th message read, "Elena Renata Marsh, you danced with Dominic Varro and didn't tell me." Elena sat with her coffee and her phone, and the slowly dawning understanding that the man who had said, "I'll marry you like it was a weather report," was not. In fact, joking. She had assumed he was joking. She had been wrong about that. What followed was not a fairy tale. Elena was clear-eyed enough to know the difference between a fairy tale and the thing that was actually happening. Which was this. Dominic Varro sent a car for her the next afternoon, not a message. Not a phone call. A car. Which arrived at the address he'd apparently obtained through methods she preferred not to examine too closely, and when she got in, more out of incredulous curiosity than anything else, she was taken to a restaurant that had no name visible on the outside, and where every table was empty except one. He was already there. "You came," he said. "I want to understand," Elena said, sitting down across from him. "Whether you were being metaphorical." "I wasn't. Men don't propose to women they've danced with once." "I do," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then at her, and something in his face did something complicated. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "Her name was Catherine. She was extraordinary. And when she died, I decided that there was not going to be anyone after her, because the idea was insane, and also because I didn't particularly want there to be." He paused. "Then I watched you count the ceiling for 47 minutes and laugh when you told me about the swan. And something in me that had been very quiet for a very long time became extremely loud." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "That is either the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "or it's something I should be very concerned about." "It might be both," he admitted. She laughed. He watched her laugh the way someone watches something rare. They did not get engaged that week, or the week after. What happened was slower than that, and stranger, a series of dinners, then afternoons, then evenings that ran past midnight. Dominic Varro, Elena discovered, was a man of absolute contradictions. He ran an empire through controlled violence and strategic fear, and he also kept a shelf of first-edition poetry collections in his private office and could cite Keats from memory. He had not smiled at a gala in 4 years, and he called her every morning at 7:15 to ask if she'd eaten breakfast, in a tone of voice that suggested the question was the most important thing he would do all day. His world tried to stop what was happening between them. Not subtly. Elena received a visit from a woman named Harriet Vane, Dominic's older sister, who had the same jaw, and none of the warmth, who sat across from her in Elena's small apartment and looked at it the way you look, at something that confirms your low expectations. "He's not in his right mind," Harriet said. "He's been isolated for 3 years. You represent novelty. This will pass." "Possibly," Elena said, because she wasn't going to pretend she had certainties. She didn't have. "He cannot marry someone like you." "Like me," Elena repeated. "You work as a records coordinator for a hospital system. You live in a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate. You attend charity galas as a favor to your cousin." Harriet's voice carried the specific flatness of someone who considers themselves to be merely stating facts. "You are not equipped for his world." Elena set down her tea. "I appreciate you coming," she said pleasantly. "I think you should go now." Harriet looked surprised. People, Elena suspected, did not often tell members of the Varro family when to leave. "This isn't finished," Harriet said at the door. "Sure," Elena said, and closed it. She called Dominic after and told him what had happened. There was a silence on his end that had a particular texture to it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. Are you going to handle it?" "Yes." "Dominic." She waited until she was sure he was listening carefully. "Handle it your way. Not your family's way." Another silence. "Then you know what my way is. Your way is words," she said. "You're actually very good at them. You just don't use them often enough." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated. 7:15 tomorrow," he said finally. "Eat breakfast before I call." She smiled at the ceiling of her apartment. "I always do." The proposal, when it came, was private and without spectacle. They were in his kitchen, a kitchen that looked designed for a professional chef and was mostly used, she'd learned, for the coffee he made every morning himself because it was the one domestic ritual he'd kept from his marriage and refused to give up. She was sitting on the counter, reading something on her phone. He was standing at the stove. He turned around and said, "I'd like to try. With you. If you're willing to let me." Elena looked at him. Dominic Varro, who controlled more of this city's darkness than the city itself knew, standing in his kitchen in a worn grey shirt, asking her with the most careful hope she had ever seen on a human face. "Yes," she said. "I can't promise it will be easy." He said, "My world is, I know what your world is. It's going to try to break you. Things have tried before." She said, "I'm still here." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and she could see him deciding something the same way she'd watched him decide to cross the ballroom that first night. Then he put his hand against her face with a gentleness that was almost painful in how carefully he was holding it. "I've been afraid," he said, "every day since Catherine died, and that wanting something again would be the thing that finally broke me." Elena covered his hand with hers. And now, he said. "I think not wanting anything was already doing it." The wedding was small by Varro standards, which still meant 240 people in a venue that cost more than Elena's apartment building. She wore a champagne gown, not white, a detail that caused 3 separate conversations she didn't care about, and carried flowers she'd picked herself from a market on Delancey Street that morning, which caused a 4th conversation she cared about even less. Harriet sat in the 3rd row and wore a grey dress, and looked at the ceremony with the expression of someone being proven wrong and finding it genuinely unpleasant. When the officiant reached the part about unexpected beginnings, Elena heard a sound from the front row and turned slightly to see one of Dominic's lieutenants, a man named Garrett, built like a door, who had once made a city councilman cry just by standing next to him, quietly wiping his eye with a folded handkerchief. She looked at Dominic. He looked back at her. "Did you brief Garrett on the ceremony ahead of time?" she asked quietly. "He asked for a copy of the vows," Dominic said, equally quietly. "I told him they were private. He cried anyway. He always does," Dominic said, with a fondness in his voice that would have astonished anyone who'd ever sat across a negotiating table from him. "He cried at the end of a nature documentary last month." The officiant cleared his throat. They looked forward again. Later, weeks later, when the dust had settled and the world had adjusted to the idea of Elena Varro, the way it adjusts to anything inevitable, she and Dominic stood on the terrace of the house that was now hers too, looking out at the city. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Which part? Any of it?" She thought about the ballroom, the chandelier with its 612 crystals, the borrowed green gown she'd returned the next morning, the man who had crossed the room for her like it was the most logical thing in the world and said, "Dance with me," like it was a foregone conclusion. She thought about Harriet's face at the door of her apartment, about the 7:15 calls, about the kitchen and the careful hope in his eyes, and the way he held things gently when he thought no one was looking. "No," she said. He looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that passed through him like light through glass. The one that had no name because she suspected it was something he'd stopped believing he could feel. "Good," he said, the city spread out below them, glittering and full of secrets. His hand found hers in the dark. The swan survived. "By the way," she said. He glanced at her. "What?" "The sugar swan. From the gala. Britt told me later. It made it to the end of the night without a scratch. Apparently, the man you assigned to guard it took the job very seriously." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Of course he did," he said. "I gave him specific instructions." Elena turned to look at him fully. "You gave your enforcer specific instructions about a sugar swan. It mattered to you," he said, as though this were the entire explanation, which for him, she had learned. It was. She looked at him for a long time. "You know," she said, "when you said you'd marry me if I danced that waltz, I thought you were being strange and a little frightening." "I was," he said. "You were also right." He turned to face her. The city light caught the edges of his face. "I usually am," he said. And this time, the smile reached all the way. She laughed. And the sound went out over the city. And somewhere below them, the lights kept burning. And Dominic Varro, who had not danced in 4 years and had been afraid for 3 and had walked across a ballroom on the night that changed everything, held his wife's hand and let himself, finally, be something other than alone.